Welcome, everyone. I'm Terry Maggedy, the chair of our elder law section of the Trust and Estates section of the Beverly Hills Bar. It's good to have everybody here via Zoom. The first thing you're seeing on the screen is membership information, professional, sustainer, economy. So you could choose any of those for your membership, and encourage you to join. Beverly Hills Bar is a great organization. And the first thing I do is thank our sponsors for our program, because our sponsors are what make make our organization run. They help financially, and they're very involved in other ways as well. We have 4 sponsors for this Trust and Estates section, all of whom are very involved in the special areas that we deal with: probates, conservatorships, older people, relating to real estate, all these areas, and our sponsors are specialists in each of these areas, particularly with respect to real estate. First, the Sanborn team, Nancy Sanborn, Trust and Estates Specialist. You see their picture there. Longtime sponsor of the Elder Law Committee. Next, Geffen Real Estate, Orit Gadish, also specializing in the probate field, a new sponsor for our group, who's also a very successful real estate broker, closing lots of deals, doing everything that's involved in sales. Next, we have Glen Oaks Escrow, Marcia Klein, an escrow company, also specializing in our probate and conservatorship area. You see their company picture and name on the screen now. And finally, California Title Company, a title company who also is very involved, very specialized in our probate world. So I want to thank all the sponsors for their support. And now we'll start our program. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Emily Camastra. Emily is just a top-notch advisor and litigator for employees in relationship to all sorts of special employee matters that anyone who's an employer has to deal with. She's a partner with Swerdlow, Florence, Sanchez, Swerdlow, and Wimmer. She is involved in lots of different labor and employment issues. She has defended not only single claims of employment discrimination, but she's handled class action suits, which are, as people know, very complicated. Wage and hour class actions, other class actions, and all sorts of labor-related matters. So we're fortunate today to have Emily here to present to us, and doing a niche topic, as we always do on the Elder Law Committee. We tie it into our area, which is older people. So Emily is going to give us a presentation about older employees in the age of COVID-19, what everyone should know from an employer perspective and what everyone should know from an employee perspective as well. So I'm going to turn the program over to Emily now, and I'm going to take myself off the screen, and I'll be back in about 55 minutes at 1:30. Emily, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Terry. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm going to share my screen with everyone. Great. So as Terry said, my name is Emily Camastra. I'm a labor and employment attorney, and I represent employers, both on the advice side and then on the litigation side. And since March, all of my normal litigation cases have been put on hold. due to backlogs in the courts and restrictions in the courts. And a lot of my practice has been focused on COVID, actually, because there's just so many questions about what workplaces should do, what happens when someone gets sick, how to protect people. So when Terry asked if I was willing to talk about older employees, I've of course said yes, because this is a really big topic right now, given that older people, older employees are more at risk for severe illness related to COVID. And although, information about COVID is changing constantly in terms of what we know about how the virus transmits, or what are the symptoms, what are the treatments, one thing that has remained constant is our information that as a person ages, their risk for severe illness increases as well. So individuals who are age 50 are at a higher risk than individuals who are age 40. People in their 60s and 70s are even at a higher risk. And then people age 85 and older are at the most high risk for severe illness from the disease. So with that in mind, I kind of want to walk through a couple of topics in this area, both in terms of what rights employees have in the workplace to protect themselves based on their age or any related, perhaps, disabilities, and then what obligations employers have to protect such employees, and then sort of common sense and required steps that, that both employees and employers should take to limit the spread and to protect people. So before I get into that topic, I just wanted to take a moment to look at some recent data from the CDC. So this chart here shows that for the weekend, this was a week ending August 15th, 2020, you see that as age increases, the hospitalizations due to COVID by age per 100,000 population also increase. So for people age 65 or older, there's roughly 400 hospitalizations due to COVID per 100,000 population. And when you break down that category even further, people in the 85 plus are in the have the highest hospitalization proportion. So that just shows, substantiates our knowledge that age really is a big factor here for hospitalization. In addition, the CDC has provided this graphic that shows that mortality rates are highest for individuals age 65 and older. And in fact, 8 out of 10 COVID-related deaths reported in the United States have been among adults age 65 and older. So this drives home that the toll that the virus is really taking on the elderly community. And just this next chart, I've also pulled from the CDC website, cdc.gov. It shows hospitalizations per 100,000, and it breaks it down by race and ethnicity. So for each subgroup, you'll see that the trend holds true. With increased age comes increased hospitalizations, with certain groups being disproportionately affected, specifically the Native American, Black, and Hispanic populations. The elderly in those groups are even more at risk for severe illness or hospitalization due to COVID. Now, with all these rather grim statistics, employers may be tempted to take some actions that perhaps single out employees or treat them differently, single out older employees or treat them differently than younger employees due to their age. And for potentially benevolent reasons. These actions could be, requiring an older worker to telework while permitting younger employees to work in the office. An employer might contemplate moving an older worker from the front of the office to the back of the office so that they do not interact with the general public, or changing their job duties in some ways that limits their interaction. Some employers might consider furloughing just older workers, letting younger workers remain, or only mandating masks or personal protective equipment for older workers. So even if those acts are taken with, good motives, those are all examples of unlawful discrimination. And I will explain here why. So there are several different federal and state laws that protect individuals on the basis of age. And the ADEA, or Age Discrimination in Employment Act, applies nationally, and it prohibits employers with at least 20 or more employees from discriminating against workers that are at age 40 or older. And that discrimination can include, prohibiting employers from segregating or classifying people in any way that would deprive or tend to deprive them of opportunities. So in addition to the federal law, there is the California law, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, or commonly known as FEHA, and that also prohibits discrimination based on a wide variety of bases, and age 40 and over is among them. Slightly broader than the ADEA because it applies to employers with just 5 or more employees. And as a result of the COVID pandemic, the EEOC released guidance specifically saying that the ADEA prohibits a covered employer from involuntarily excluding from the workplace someone who's age 65 or older, even if the employer is doing that for benevolent reasons to protect the employee due to maybe their higher risk of COVID. So the key there is taking steps that involuntarily exclude people from the workplace based on age. That's unlawful, no matter what the motive is. So although employers cannot be forced, employees cannot be forced to accept accommodations, employers are permitted to provide flexibility to workers that are age 65 or older. So according to that EEOC's most recent guidance, the ADEA does not prohibit this, even if it results in younger workers being treated less favorably. So for example, if someone who's age 65 or older requests to work at home, or to work a different schedule, or to work different duties, request some kind of accommodation like that, the employer can permit that while not providing that option to younger workers. So that's something that the EEOC has said is good and should be, can be implemented. So, what's important to note here is that these laws, the ADEA, FEHA, they do not include a right to reasonable accommodation, meaning, there's no, just by the basis of someone being in that age category, they don't have a right to request they don't have a right to obtain an accommodation, either a changed schedule or working from home. But employers can be flexible, and they should be flexible. So the focus should be on what the employee voluntarily requests, and then what the employer permits. So that's really all that is to say, is that in this uncertain time, employers should be flexible and work out arrangements that work best for everybody. With that said, even though age in and of itself does not entitle someone to a reasonable accommodation per se, someone who's in an older age category may also have some underlying medical conditions and be quote unquote disabled, which wouldn't entitle them to reasonable accommodation, more than just flexibility. And I should also say, if anyone has questions, I should have said this at the beginning, you can chat or send me a chat or send a question through the Q&A. And I think they should be popping up. So I'll either answer questions during, or I'll save them for the end. Okay, so with that said, Older employees may have medical conditions that bring them under the protection of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that's a separate law, which is also a federal law, and it just had its 30-year anniversary this summer. But the ADA applies to employers with 15 or more employees, and it protects individuals from discrimination who have disabilities. And one of the features of the ADA is that not only does it prohibit discrimination against disabled people, but it affirmatively requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to employees. And there's different, both under federal law and California law, there's different definitions of who's disabled, and oftentimes that's disputed, but generally, under federal law, someone is disabled if they have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, or if that person has a record of such impairment, or if that person is just regarded as having such impairment. So someone doesn't even need to necessarily have a disability as long as the employer suspects or thinks that the person has a disability to be covered. So in this scenario, what I'm kind of trying to get at is if someone requests a reasonable accommodation on the basis of having a disability as opposed to their age, then the employer would have an obligation to engage in the interactive process to determine if there's any reasonable accommodation that could exist for that person. And in addition to the ADA, there's also the California law, which is called the Fair Employment and Housing Act. And it applies to employers with 5 or more employees. So it's broader than the federal law, and most California laws in this regard are. And it also is broader in terms of what it defines as a disability. Under California law, the limitation need not be substantial. It would be sufficient if the limitation is if it just limits some life activity. So people with short-term conditions may qualify under FEHA for a disability where they may not under the ADA. Okay. So what's important to note here is that so as I mentioned, in addition to prohibiting discrimination against people with disabilities, these laws require employers to actively make reasonable accommodations for known disabilities of employees to enable them to perform the essential functions of their job, unless doing so would result in an undue hardship. So it's not just a requirement to treat everyone equally, like you have under the age discrimination laws, but it's a requirement to actually treat people with disabilities more favorably. Give them the resources, perhaps leave, a different schedule, modified duties, give them that leg up so that they can perform their essential functions and level the playing field. That's the concept of reasonable accommodation. And to do this, employers have to engage in the interactive process, which is a back and forth dialogue between the employer and the employee to determine what's the best reasonable accommodation that we can give you at this time. Okay, let's see. Okay, turning back to COVID, the CDC provides that there's certain groups of people with the following conditions that are at an increased risk for severe illness from COVID-19 as a result of having these conditions. So people with cancer, people with kidney disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, people who have had organ transplants and thus have a compromised immune system, also at an increased risk. Obesity is one that we know and talk about a lot. Heart conditions, sickle cell disease, and type 2 diabetes. These are all sort of underlying medical conditions that, like increased age, also can result in someone having a more severe version of COVID-19. In addition to these diseases, the CDC said there's also some underlying medical conditions which might increase someone's risk for severe illness for COVID. And these conditions that might increase the risk include things like asthma, they're here on the chart, cerebrovascular disease, cystic fibrosis, hypertension, someone who has an immunocompromise because they may have HIV or have had a blood transplant or bone marrow transplant, dementia actually, liver disease, we've got pregnancy, smoking, and type 1 diabetes. So these are all other conditions that may cause an individual to have a severe illness if they were to develop COVID. Okay, so thus older employees and really employees of any age who have any of those underlying conditions or any others that might cause them to have an increased risk of COVID may require reasonable accommodations if they request such in order to eliminate their potential exposure to the disease in the workplace. So these are some examples the EEOC has identified as possible accommodations for such employees with such underlying diseases. Maybe doing a temporary job restructuring, so taking some of their duties and moving them to other employees that are not in a high-risk pool. Transferring the employee maybe temporarily to a different position so that they don't interact with the public or so that they have less exposure with other employees overall. Or modifying their work schedule or shift assignment, maybe allowing the employee to come to work earlier or leave work earlier, also just to avoid exposure to others. And the key to note is that when an employer is identifying these reasonable accommodations and trying to work out with the employee what's going to work, the employer doesn't have to pick the exact accommodation that the employee requests. The key is just to have this back and forth dialogue so that all parties can find an accommodation that's going to be appropriate. And the key is really to permit the individual with a disability to work safely in the workplace while reducing exposure to others. Because it's that exposure to others that will increase their risk of developing COVID. And just one quick point on medical documentation here. If someone's really of any age, an older employee or an employee of any age who has one of those underlying medical conditions, if it's not obvious or the employer doesn't know about it, the employer can request medical documentation to determine whether the disability needs an accommodation or whether there's some other accommodation that could be better. So that kind of medical documentation can be requested. I get a lot of questions when this comes up about, well, can I, this accommodation that they're asking for, let's say they're asking for a certain amount of leave, would this be would this qualify as an undue hardship such that the employer doesn't need to provide it? So while it's true that both under federal and California law, employers don't need to provide accommodations if doing so would be an undue hardship, I tell people undue hardship is usually a higher bar than many employers think it is. And it really means, and what an undue hardship is some significant difficulty or expense, and it focuses on the resources of and the circumstances of that particular employer. And it looks at that in relation to the cost or difficulty of providing the accommodation. So, larger employers who have more resources, have more, financial capabilities, they're going to have a harder time saying that a specific accommodation might be an undue hardship. And an undue hardship is not just a financial difficulty, but it can also be things that are either unduly extensive, like requesting a long amount of leave time, or disruptive to the business, but that would fundamentally alter operations, things like that. But really, truly, employers have to do case-by-case analysis and say, is this accommodation really a hardship on our business, or is it something that we can do? And like I said, larger businesses with more financial resources, they're going to have a hard time saying that an accommodation is that it's an undue hardship. What's interesting is that the EEOC has recently said that this pandemic has obviously caused a lot of economic uncertainty out there, and that what may not have been an undue burden pre-COVID, that might be an undue burden going forward. So in addition to assessing, the facts and circumstances of the employer, you look at, the economic climate that we're in today. Okay. But with just going back with any kind of reasonable accommodation, if an employee requests something that is an undue hardship, like a different schedule or a leave of absence, and an employer says no, that what you're asking for is not going to work, employers have an obligation to then continue the dialogue to see if a different alternate accommodation can be accounted for, and can be implemented that would allow the employee to perform the essential functions of their job. Okay, so one question that I've gotten quite a bit is regarding an employee who maybe themselves are not in the older category or not disabled, but they take care or they live with a parent or a family member who is disabled or who is at a higher risk of getting severe illness from COVID. And what are the employer's obligations relating to that non-disabled employee? And do they have an obligation to accommodate that? And the answer technically is no. The ADA does prohibit discriminating and harassing against employees who are associated with disabled individuals. So it would be unlawful to terminate someone because they're a caretaker for their ill parent, or because they have a sick child at home who would be disabled. It's unlawful to discriminate, harass against people on that basis. But the ADA does not require an employer to accommodate, meaning to go and take action to take action favorably to an employee without a disability based on the disability-related needs of a family member or other person with whom he or she is associated. So the law does not require an employer to accommodate that kind of employee's request. However, the employer can choose to be flexible for such employees and say, okay, you live with your mother, she's got type 2 diabetes, you need to work from home, we can work something out, we can let that happen. So again, flexibility here is encouraged and permitted. Employers should be careful when doling out these accommodations that they're done so on a neutral basis, so that the employers are not engaging in any disparate treatment when they give out the accommodation. So, avoiding allowing, only white employees to get such accommodations while denying that to Hispanics. That would be its own form of discrimination. So just be mindful of that as well. Okay, so I see I have a couple questions. I'm gonna do my questions at the end, that way we'll catch up. So those are sort of the big picture ideas that I've talked about so far regarding discrimination and reasonable accommodation of both people who are older employees and employees with underlying medical conditions. But now I'd like to discuss sort of the concrete steps that people in the workplace and employers, specifically in LA County and LA City, must take to protect employees, especially the employees in these most vulnerable populations. So everyone's familiar with the stay-at-home orders, and since March they've been changed periodically, updated. So as of now, the Los Angeles County order is called the Reopening Safer at Work Order, revised August 12, 2020. And it, as the very first order of its kind did, permits essential businesses to continue operating normally. And those essential businesses are grocery stores, gas stations, banks, hardware stores, those kind of businesses. They can operate as if they always had, just they must implement sort of the social distancing protocols. What this LA County order says about non-essential office-based businesses, however, it has a separate category for that. And these, are the more typical, what we think of as, office workers. Those businesses, their indoor operations must cease until further notice, and telework and minimum basic operations only. So, in LA County right now, if your business falls under this non-essential office-based business, really everyone should be teleworking, and encourages people to work from home. And if you have people going into the office, that it should just be for the minimum basic operations. And the other thing to note in this LA order is just across the whole board for all industries, it says all persons who can telework or work from home should continue to do so as much as possible during the pandemic. And it also states that the health officer strongly recommends that all employees or that all employers offer telework or other accommodations to persons who are age 65 or older, and to all people of any age who have an active or unstable pre-existing health condition. So what I said earlier about all these accommodations, those are sort of general principles here in LA County. If you've got employees that are 65 or older, the health department strongly encourages that they telework, and that the employer find ways to have that person telework, meaning work from home, which I'm doing. I'm sure a lot of you are all doing right now too. And for each business, each industry in LA County, there is a different appendix. So, Appendix B is for retail stores. Appendix C is for manufacturing. Appendix D is for, again, this non-essential office-based businesses, which are normal offices. And each employer has to fill out this appendix. They're online. The blank templates are online. You have to fill them out, hand them out to employees so that they see what the rules are, and then post it as well. So, and these appendices are getting updated frequently, so be on the lookout for those. But what's important about Appendix D for the non-essential office businesses is that it requires the employer to certify that vulnerable staff, those at 65 or older, as well as actually those who are pregnant and those with chronic health conditions, are assigned work that can be done from home whenever possible, and should discuss any concerns with their healthcare provider or occupational health services to make appropriate decisions about returning to the workplace. So employers have to check this box, basically certifying everyone in these vulnerable categories, older employees, age 65 and older, they've all been instructed to work at home when possible. So that's something to be mindful of when you're deciding who's coming into the office, who's working from home, those kind of things. LA City also has its own Safer LA order, which is similar to the LA County order, and honestly, they sort of work in tandem. It was the LA City's order was updated August 7th, and it too specifically, provides that essential businesses can continue. And it states that the essential activities include office-based businesses when teleworking is not possible. So the implication being, if telework is possible, people should be teleworking and not going into a physical office. So, right. So these are, the general rules that apply to Los Angeles County, Los Angeles City, and they're very strict in terms of what needs to be done going forward. And in terms of what employers should do, how to implement these rules about working in an office, the first thing that employers should do is to protect older employees and all employees is to create a COVID plan. So that's perhaps a written document that describes what's going to happen in the workplace for people that are in the workplace, for people that are at home, what are the procedures for dealing with COVID. And in order to create that plan that will protect employees, employers first have to identify what level of risk their workplace is. So there's OSHA guidance that sort of helps in that regard. It identifies different workplaces based on risks, and there's 4 main risks categories. The lower risk are workplaces that have either no or very little contact with the public. The medium risk is, frequent or close contact with the public. And then the high and very high risk are, kind of those medical professions that are, potentially exposing themselves to COVID, doing health procedures that may infect employees with COVID. So for the high and very high, I'm putting that to the side since those are more specialized workplaces. And we're going to focus on the low and medium risk workplaces. And I just want to turn and discuss a few things that can be done and that should be done really based on being in LA City and LA County to have sort of the proper protocols for these lower and medium risk workplaces. The first of which is temperature checks. So I get a lot of questions, do we need to do temperature checks? Does it need to be for all employees, only certain employees? How does that work? And the LA County order specifically says that temperature checks of employees should be done at the workplace if feasible. So, that gives some leeway if the workplace perhaps is not set up for it, or if it can't be done, if it can't be done, it can't be done. But if a workplace can do it, it should be screening, not only the vulnerable, but everybody, employees and non-employees who enter the premises should be screened with a non-contact thermometer. And that should be done by someone who's trained on how to use it. If someone has a temperature of 104 degrees or higher, that person should be excluded from the workplace. What's important to note is that someone's temperature reading, that's considered confidential medical information. So the employer will want to safeguard that, make sure it's not something that information that gets spread around to other employees, treat it as confidential information, and limit it to people that need to know. Another concern is that, standing in line for a temperature check, waiting around for one, that could be seen as time that is compensable, that employees should be paid for. So if you're going to be doing temperature checks, think about where they're going to be done. Are employees going to clock in on the time clock before they get in line for the temperature check? Are you going to just add 5 or 10 minutes to people's time based on how long they had to wait to get one done? Just make sure that people are, if they're a non-exempt employee, that they're getting paid for the time that it takes to go through that process. In another step to protect older employees as well as all employees is for employers to screen for symptoms. So just have a sign outside that specifically says, do not enter if you have any of these COVID symptoms, or even to have someone who's a screener asking employees as they come in, are you experiencing any of these symptoms? And if so, requiring them to go home. So here on the slide here, I have the symptoms that the CDC identifies as symptoms of COVID-19. We all know about the cough, the fever, shortness of breath. In recent More recently, they've added other symptoms such as congestion or runny nose, nausea or vomiting, and diarrhea. These are things that might not be COVID, but if an employee reports having them, it would behoove employers to send those people home, even if it's a symptom that's not, the typical fever or cough. Other things to protect older workers in the workplace and all employees, of course, is social distancing. And the first sort of principle of social distancing is just to have, everyone who can work at home should be working at home, and that's in the LA order. But for those people that have to be in the workplace or that need to be there, requiring that they have the 6 feet of space. So this may not only just be telling them just keep your distance, but also reconfiguring workspaces. So moving desks, moving offices around, staggering breaks, staggering work shifts so people don't interact. Those kind of things can help to promote social distancing. Of course, in-person meetings should, according to the LA order, are strongly discouraged. So even people who are working in the same building, in the same office, should be video conferencing or having telephone conferences if they need to talk to each other rather than meeting face-to-face. If you do need to have an in-person meeting, the LA ordinance says, a 10-person maximum. But of course, you need it someplace large enough where you can have that many people. But again, that's discouraged. Limiting travel, non-essential travel should be discontinued. And then limiting how many people can be in each room, in restrooms, in conference rooms, that will help limit the spread. One issue that comes up a lot is elevators, particularly for offices that are in high rises or that rely on elevators to just transport people to this office suite. So the guidance from the CDC that LA County has adopted are that people should maintain 6 feet of space even in an elevator, which can be adjusted so that you have 4 people max per elevator. And the elevator should sort of have this diagram that sort of separates people into the different quadrants of the elevator. Employers themselves may have difficulty enforcing some of these rules because the elevators might be part of the building, but things to ask the building are, can there be elevator attendants that help adjust the flow? Can certain elevators be assigned just to certain floors to limit people from crossing paths? Can you encourage certain employees on the lower floors to use the stairs instead of elevators? And can certain stairwells be designated up and down so that you're not crossing paths in a stairwell? You have just sort of one flow. Other things to limit spread and to protect older employees are to think about where people in the workplace are lining up or where they could congregate and separate them with markers or tape so that, just like at the supermarket, so people know where to be standing to avoid overcrowding. So places like right in front of the time clock or in front of the copier, places where you think people might be queuing or forming a line, make sure that there's markers for enough space. And again, regarding flow, can you have office flow? So one hallway goes south, one hallway goes north, so that you can limit people from passing by each other. Another thing is that employers must provide employees with cloth face masks if they're going to be having contact with the public or with other employees. And employees should be instructed on how to wash them daily. Another tip for protecting older employees is that employers, per the LA County order, must frequently disinfect high contact areas. So we're talking the copier, the refrigerator, microwave, all those items that get touched a lot need to be sanitized more frequently. Employees should be given hand sanitizer, and soap and water should be made available with the instruction to, take frequent breaks to wash hands. And employees should be given instruction on hand hygiene specifically in that regard. One question we get is, okay, well, what happens when someone tests positive in the workplace? The first thing to do is to figure out from that infected employee, who did you have close contact with? And close contact is defined as being within 6 feet for 15 or more minutes, within 48 hours prior to having symptoms or testing positive. So for all, you're going to want to ask that employee, who did you have the close contact with? If you have any video surveillance, you can see and confirm whether anyone else. Then you want to inform those employees. You don't want to tell them who has COVID in the workplace. That's confidential. But say, we have reason to believe you've had close contact with someone who has COVID. And all those people should be quarantined for 14 days, meaning work, be at home, don't come to work. There's certain exception for critical infrastructure workers who can continue to work, but if you're not in that critical group, then the quarantine applies. Following a COVID infection, the employer should, deep clean all the areas used by the infected person in the 7 days prior. And if you can, the CDC recommends waiting 24 hours to do the deep clean, just opening windows and doors as much to kind of let the air come through before the deep clean happens, and that's to protect the cleaners. One thing to note is that if an employer has 3 or more cases within a 2-week period, that needs to be reported to the LA Department of Public Health. And then that will trigger a response from the Department of Public Health. Someone who has COVID, what are their options for how long must they be out of work? Well, they technically have to be isolated until these 3 certain circumstances have passed. So they have to have no fever for 24 hours without the use of medicine. 10 days, at least 10 days have passed since their symptoms first appeared. And then all other COVID symptoms have resolved. So when those things happen, someone diagnosed with COVID can then return to work. If someone diagnosed with COVID did not have any symptoms, it was asymptomatic but received a positive test, they also have to isolate, and they can return 10 days after their first positive test, so long as they have no other symptoms. One thing to note is that if an employee does develop COVID, you're going to want to determine, did they get it at work? And if they got it at work, that needs to be reported to OSHA. It might be pretty hard to determine where and when somebody got COVID. But factors you can think of to consider are, was their type of job something where they interacted with the public a lot? Did they interact with someone else who who has COVID? What are the protocols in place that protected people? So employers can rely on those guideposts to determine. I kind of want to just mention really briefly that this topic of paid sick leave, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, the first sort of nationwide mandate of paid sick leave, which was passed this spring, it provides 2 weeks or up to 80 hours of employees of paid sick leave, capped either $500 per day or $5,110 over that 2-week period. If an employee can't work or telework because they're subject to an isolation order due to COVID, they've been told by a healthcare provider not to work because of COVID, or they just have some symptoms and they're seeking diagnosis. So they're going to the doctor, they're trying to figure out if they have COVID. was pretty revolutionary in that Congress has never passed a paid sick leave law before. California has its own, but it applies to employers with fewer than 500 employees. And again, if an older worker needs to isolate, this would be an option for them to receive paid sick leave. The same law also provides the similar amount of paid sick leave for other reasons, but just at less, the pay is less if you need to take sick leave because you're caring for someone who's subject to a quarantine order, or if the employee's son or daughter, their school is closed due to COVID, or some other reasons. So there's other reasons for paid sick leave, just at a reduced amount. One more thing to note is that employees can get paid up to 2/3 of the regular pay, or $200 per day, if they're taking family medical leave, in order to care for a child whose school or childcare is closed because of COVID. And this includes having, needing to take off from work because school is closed due to remote learning. So schools that are, they're considered closed even if the kids are at home doing their schooling from home. Again, this only applies to employers with fewer than 500 employees. And, even though it requires employers to pay, there are payroll tax credits. So the government is theoretically going to reimburse employers for paying for that. I'm not going to go into detail here, but in addition to those federal paid sick leave requirements, there are state, Los Angeles city has its own supplemental paid sick leave. California, that applies to employers with more than 500 employees. If they have 500 in the city of LA, or just one in the city of LA and 2,000 nationally. And also California passed its own paid sick leave law for food sector workers who work for a company with more than 500 employees. And these, state and local laws, they're meant to sort of fill in the gap where the federal law only applied to employers with fewer than 500 employees. And, these are all important topics, not only to protect older workers and vulnerable workers in the workplace, but, they could potentially, failure to follow these guidelines can potentially expose employers to OSHA complaints, Cal-OSHA complaints, tort lawsuits, perhaps for negligence, workers' compensation claims. I didn't mention, but there was, until June, a presumption that the governor signed an executive order creating a presumption that if an employee contracts COVID, that they contracted it at work, and that they're working to extend right now, the legislature. And also employers can face discrimination lawsuits for failing to accommodate disabilities, just as we described earlier. So an important thing to do is to protect older workers and vulnerable workers is for employers to implement a COVID plan. And this should be written in writing, designating a specific person as the COVID workplace coordinator who will monitor developments as things change with the CDC and execute logistics. And that written plan should be signed by employees so that everyone knows what the rules are, what their rights are. I did want to mention this is a little slightly off topic, but with a lot of the deaths in California have been a result of elderly people in nursing homes. So what's important to note for both employers and employees at nursing homes is that the Department of Public Health has issued guidelines that are specific for skilled nursing facilities. And these get updated regularly. August 13th, 2020 was the most recent. And it states, non-essential visits are not allowed. Certain essential visitors may be allowed, but that's a very narrow group of people. And Symptoms and temperature checks have to happen there twice daily for staff, patients, and residents. I've posted a link here for all the, for the rules relating to skilled nursing facilities. So if you have family in one or related in any way to working with one, those separate rules apply at those facilities. I've posted some links here to some resources, and hopefully you'll get these slides so you can have them. These are different resources from the DOL, OSHA, the EEOC, and this last link is very helpful. It's from the CDC Guidelines for businesses and employers to plan and respond to COVID. And that's written very common sense, very layman's terms for just how to deal with COVID in the workplace. Okay, I have a couple questions here, which now I can turn to. I have a couple minutes. And are older employees for state and federal law defined as above 65? So actually, no. The discrimination laws protect people age 40 and over, which it seems like a bit of a random number. But when these laws were passed, that was just the number they came up with. So anyone over 40 is protected from age discrimination. What has happened with COVID is because 65 is seen as sort of the cutoff for having more severe illness as a result of COVID. The EEOC has said employers can, take measures with employees' voluntary choice that protect people age 65 or older, even if people who are between 40 and 64 are not treated as favorably. So that's that key there. For disabled in the ADA, there's no application for disabilities unrelated to respiratory issues, but rather something like hearing impairment. So someone who's hearing impaired under the ADA would be entitled to a reasonable accommodation. I didn't list it in my chart because that's not something that has a link to COVID as causing more severe illness if you were to get COVID. But anyone who has a limitation, such as hearing impairment, would be entitled to a reasonable accommodation for that disability. One other question I got here is non-contact temperature. Who should be assigned to take those? So an office administrator, someone in the office should be tasked, or multiple people should be tasked. It shouldn't be sort of like a line level employee. Perhaps someone in HR who's going to be trained on how to do it and to keep the information confidential. So, different companies may think of different people in the best position to do that. But it should be someone who's trained on the confidentiality. Oh, and someone noted, Lawrence Bosch noted there's an exemption in the governor's mask policy for people with hearing impairments. That's true. If wearing a mask would interfere with their use, that's true. There are exemptions for people who have medical complications with wearing masks. So thanks for that point.
I think we were just perfect timing because we got through all the questions too. Emily, thank you so much for just a great presentation. Whoa, that's a lot of material. Very interesting and challenging. So thank you again for the great presentation. Thank you, guests out there in the Zoom audience, for joining. And now we'll sign off. See you next time. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you. Thanks, bye.
Bye, everybody.